Hi, I'm David Gornoski, and today we're going to talk about the Libertarian Party Convention and my thoughts on the Libertarian Party itself, its purpose, as well as a little bit on libertarianism and anarchism as a philosophy and where I differ with these things. And also, we'll try to look at positives and negatives too, to look at the full scope of things. I think it's important when we talk about ideology to remember that these things are masks that end up hiding what is in reality rivalry with different factions of people. We're in rivalry with one another for the same thing. Oftentimes, that rivalry that we get drawn into is for things like power or to be considered to be high status, to be the most intelligent, to be the most morally right, to be the most popular, to be the cool, whatever description is really driving someone's appetite to compete with somebody else and jockey with lunchroom drama. It can be anything. Vegetarianism battling carnivores, carnivores battling, you know, repeat people, whatever. There's always going to be ideological tribes that form and then are actually vying for something deeper than that which they say they're united around. So, first of all, this Libertarian Party Convention just happened in D.C., and they elected a guy who is I guess, more of a left-leaning libertarian on social issues and the border and so forth. So, from a tactical standpoint, I think it's a very from what I see happening, it was a pretty smart move given the options that the Libertarian Party had, particularly as it pertains to the Mises faction, the Mises caucus group. I think people realized that, in my opinion, that faction realized that they didn't really want to be scapegoated for the return of Biden for another 4 years after they saw what happened, particularly with the level of insane, crazy, violent authoritarianism that has been taking place for some time. From a libertarian perspective, it's pretty insanely over the top in terms of tyranny. And I think they didn't want to get blamed. I think they wanted to be able to have a seat at the table. This reminds me of the deal that the moral majority made in the 80s to align with the Republican Party and to kind of bring social issues to a higher degree of concentration within the Republican platform. And they wanted a seat at the table, right? That's why you had factions like, Pat Robertson running for president and then making a deal with Bush Sr. to have a seat at the table. And it happened before him as well. And this is a way for them to try to get a carve out for their particular issues that they were interested in at the time to be given mainstream attention by the Republican Party and be considered a key faction in their coalition. And I think that was a loser's deal they took. I think they didn't accomplish a lot of the things that they wanted to with that seat, but that's the allure of power. That's the seat of power. I think in a similar way, the folks who are a little bit more the conservative side of the Libertarian Party thought, let's leverage this vehicle of the party as a means of, gaining some results out of the candidates. And to get more relevance in terms of their ideas into the public discourse. And I think this convention show that was somewhat accomplished. It looks like that the mainstream media was giving them more attention than normal with the appearance of Donald Trump at their convention and Robert Kennedy Jr. and his VP stopping by. It put a lot of attention, and it showed that they were basically playing a game of negotiation. Come woo us, show us what you can do. This is going to be an interesting race with various candidates on the ballot. It looks like Kennedy, Trump, a Libertarian Party candidate, and a Democrat, and some others. So this is a very interesting dynamic where you got to have to get all your little factions coalescing as much as possible. And that gave the Libertarian Party some leverage to say, come and give us your best shot. Give us what you can commit to. Trump said he would put some libertarians in his cabinet, maybe the Department of Forestry. Maybe they would be given, I'm just my idea, maybe they would be given a director role at the Library of Congress to put, Rothbard and Hoppe books on the shelf there if they're not already there. But regardless, because I don't really think there's going to be much from that. But who knows? Who knows what might happen depending on how things go. But Trump promised that. He promised to commute the sentence of Ross Ulbright, who we've had his mother on the show years ago, and tried to show as much as he could to say that he's in friendship with libertarian ideas. Got a raucous, controversial engagement because the Libertarian Party is made up of, liberals and more conservatives in a kind of 50-50 mix, it looked like. I don't know what was going on, but I think that once Dave Smith was deciding he wasn't going to run, I think he probably didn't want to get scapegoated again for getting Biden elected because of his profile that he has on various media. And I'm sure there's other factors involved in his decision, but from a strategic standpoint, when you have another 4 years of Biden to look forward to, I don't think you want to have that on your resume that, well, I'm the guy that people are going to blame the rest of history for giving us 4 more years of that horrible, disaster that people can imagine. So I think that was a way of him to avoid that. And once he decided to avoid that, it took a lot of the energy out of the Mises Caucus's momentum and taking over the party. And I think that, they said, well, we'll do something else with that. And perhaps maybe there was a strategic call to reduce the presence of their folks at the convention, or maybe not. Maybe they just couldn't rally that much interest to come out to the convention because their first choice, Smith, wasn't on the ballot. But regardless, it ended up doing a strategic favor for Trump because having a leftist as the party nominee, which they have now, will take more votes away from Biden than it would from Trump. And so that is, you could see that kind of conversation behind the scenes. Well, here, look, we're not going to be able to endorse you officially because you're not a libertarian up to our standards, but we'll put a leftist on our ballot this year so that we'll take more votes away from your opponent. And therefore you give us some, commitments, both on stage and off stage, of things that we will be of value for us. And then we have a little bit of an opportunity to make a deal. Is that what happened? I don't know, but it sure looks like that could have been a possible scenario explaining how this outcome happened. But I want to get into a little bit about the problem with the party's existence itself. What is the telos, the purpose of the party? I think it's fundamentally something that is confused. I can't see how you can use democracy to persuade the public out of its worship of sacrifice, its worship of the very heart and soul of what makes so-called statist societies function, which is the sacrificial machinery that we engage in, the scapegoat mechanism. You cannot persuade people out of that by getting the crowd to, come to its senses individually and rationally all say, you know what, I've just been educated enough and I realize I don't need my religion anymore. You see, the state is a vestige of deep, deep, deep anthropological patterns in history in which human beings stumbled on unconsciously a means of creating order and unity when they are threatened by chaotic violence, when they're at a state of at each other's throats, when they're at a state of aggression spilling out, bad blood, distrust, disloyalty, chaotic tensions building. Maybe it's a famine. Maybe they're having a plague, whatever it is that creates that tension of heightened sense of scarcity, people fighting over the same goods, desiring the same things, leads to inevitably negative rivalry. And that can spill into a disaster. That can spill into civil war and fractions and schisms and conflicts that can destroy a society, especially when other tribes are competing with it around the area or the region. And so you can't just, give someone a book and they rationally just come to, especially in a kind of mass scale sense, like a democracy. Okay. These are ancient vestiges of gods. democracy, general welfare, the public good, the will of the people, the word our democracy, all those terms are just modern nomenclature that actually have a history in terms like Thor, Marduk, the will of the gods, right? Now that's this transcendent external mediation in the form of a concept that before it was considered to be the form of a transcendent God or a deity of nature that was demanding sacrificial violence, demanding tokens of kind of guilt atonement in the form of people being fed to them as sacrifice, or animals being sacrificed, or other types of ways of showing tribute to this transcendent psychological need to vent our frustrations collectively onto a common enemy, a common scapegoat that you truly believe is guilty. You don't, it's not a cynical play where you say, hey guys, we're going to beat up this person because this will make a creative case. That does happen, through history, but for much of history prior to Christ, the scapegoating mechanism was a completely unconscious act in which you truly believe the person is guilty of the things that you're ascribing to them and the cause of the calamity and the distrust in the community. And of course, once you sacrifice that scapegoat, it creates such an explosive feeling of catharsis and peace between folks who were at each other's throats, that it's then remembered that perhaps that person was a god that came to teach them a lesson about the things that should be considered taboo, lest they spill out into uncontrolled violence. Things like property, like sex, like possessions, objects, living rituals, living spaces, all these different little markers of differentiation needed to be maintained as a way of preventing out of control chaos, which is called the wrath of the gods in many religions. So you can't persuade a mob to just intellectually assent out of its subconscious hunger and desire to worship a state, to worship a flag, to worship ideologies like social, democracy or wokeness or whatever little ideology stirs them into a state of, unity around a shared sense of being. You can't just snap that out. That's a deeper subconscious gut thing that you got to deal with. And that's why you have to move out of the world of ideology and into the world of anthropology to understand and even to begin to deal with the problem of state violence and the psychological appetite for it. Taking reason, bringing appeals to reason and theory and philosophy to the public to try to get 50% plus one to wake up from their stupor of hive mind sensibility is like bringing a plastic butter knife to war against a cannibalistic tribe. Okay, you're not going to win. They're going to take that butter knife and use it to carve you up alongside their more vicious weapons. It's just such a deep-seated, deeply rooted impulse to want to bind together. Remember, the word religion in the Latin root means to bind together. What binds us together is our shared hatred, our shared sense of transcendence, the flag, or international globalism, or fear of the boogeyman on the other side of the team. Something has to bind us together, and it's usually a confluence of different things that creates the experience of politics that makes people go back again and again and again and again to the same abusive dynamic that we see all around us, where our liberties are being destroyed, our economic prosperity is being leveraged by parasitical forms of central banking and all the trickery and nonsense that goes on with regulations and corporate welfare, and the attack on people's sense of sanity, attacks against boundaries of differentiation. None of this makes sense if you don't have the anthropological framework that we have been providing on the show. We're not going to get into all of that today. Our main focus is explaining why I have an issue with the party's existence and the philosophy. Because you cannot use a political tool in a democratic contest to try to, have a popularity contest for getting people out of the state. By your very nature, you're reaffirming the state's framework itself by contesting things and some type of, ideological debate format. This is very outdated. This is something that comes from another media age that we're no longer in. And it's a delusion. It's not going to work. You have to find something else. It's okay to explain ideas. And there's a lot of good ideas within libertarian philosophy, but ultimately libertarianism is a supplement that came out of a Christian fertilized ground and society. Christianity is the one that births the concept of the human person. Libertarianism is a philosophy that tries to, construct this, kind of, Cartesian ideology that shares some of the insights of the Christian worldview's impact in our society, but truncates it a little bit away from the concept of personhood and a little bit more into the concept of the individual self. The individual self is not an anthropologically accurate or truthful depiction of human people. The human person, as Christianity depicts the human person, is a much, much more accurate depiction of the reality of the human species. Because Christianity says that all we like sheep have gone astray, each into our own way. Libertarianism as a philosophy in and of itself does not account for that anthropological factor, does not account for where our desires come from. In fact, libertarianism, like a lot of Enlightenment-inspired philosophy, assumes that we are walking brains on sticks, that we just kind of walk around with our mental model kind of independently derived from some nebulous, island of our own passions, and that we then construct all of these things ourselves, all of our desires, all of our sense of self is just self-constructed. This is a deceit. This is a mythology. It's not true. It has no basis in reality, but it's a story we've told ourselves through the years. And ultimately that truncates some of the truth that could be discovered if we had a Christian personhood framework of the human being. Now, let me say this. Just because there is a little bit of a truncation, just because it's a little bit of a trifling reduction of the Christian picture of the human person, doesn't mean that libertarianism can't get some really key things right in its opposition to war, in its opposition to using the state to put people in human cages for nonviolent behavior. There's something absolutely Christian derived from these instincts. And so to the extent that political ideologies in competition with libertarianism like to deride that, they're doing so from a perspective, in my opinion, which is thoroughly unchristian. Meaning the Christian does not put his neighbor in a rape cage for getting their mind altered or some regulation violation or what have you. And so just as there is a kind of, misunderstanding of human anthropology and libertarianism, there's a even greater, perhaps, misunderstanding in human anthropology from some of its most vocal critics, those who on the right, I call them the Little Caesars, and those on the left who, McWoke or whatever you want to call them, they worship the state in a different way. Ultimately, though, libertarianism worships the state itself because it's obsessed with it. There's two ways of being mimetically, imitationally owned by something. You can be mimetically owned by something in the sense that you go to school, everybody's into country Western attire, so you dress in country Western attire. You get your hair cut the same way they do. You get your hair cut the same way the cool people in your school do. And there's a way of kind of you're owned by the mimetic contagion of the culture that you're trying to fit into. Then there's another way to do it where you go to a school that's largely rural, everybody's dressing in country Western attire or whatever, and you decide to dress in dark Gothic clothes, and you say, I'm a true individualist because I truly stand out against the crowd. No, actually, you're looking at what your neighbor's doing, and then you're mirroring the opposite pattern, which means you're still governed by what your neighbor's doing. Ultimately, libertarianism ends up doing that same thing in the sense that it ends up worshiping the state by seeing the state as the cause of all their problems, deifying it beyond something that it's not, that actually the state is a vestige of a long period of history of human anthropological development that creates ritual sacrifice that is based on lies and murder, but ultimately reflects something about ourselves that the libertarian is a little bit uncomfortable to deal with. Libertarian sensibility tends to want to say, I, because of my superior practices of reason, am different from the statist around me, and therefore I am, in some kind of unique position to be able to proselytize and wake them up out of their slumber. This is a Gnostic concept that just merely changing someone's mind is all one has to do to get them to act rightly. In reality, it doesn't work. It doesn't get any results. The public is never really persuaded in a massive scale to adopt these ideas, even though many of them are for their own good, because it's ultimately situated in a resentment towards the state. Everybody worships the state in a direct way, so I worship the state in the opposite way. It is the bane of my existence. Everything that's wrong in my life is somehow connected to the state. That means your mind is occupied and owned by what the state does, and you react to it. That's not in the driver's seat of society. When you're in a state of reaction and resentment, you're not in a state of leadership. You're not in a state of clear-headed thinking. And that's what ultimately libertarianism becomes, a reactionary impulse. You're reacting. The state does the Patriot Act. I'm so angry, we got to stop it. Those thieves. And then you react against it in anger. Reacting in a state of anger, although there is a time for anger and there is a time to react, but to make that your main disposition of how you are going to identify yourself in relation to your neighbor is not a position of leadership. It's not a position of positive imitational modeling to actually move culture and move people the way it really matters. And so situating the state in this kind of boogeyman, all-pervasive role as if you're out of it and they're in it, again, it actually, it changes your sensibility in a way that makes it an idol. And it makes you a Cartesian Gnostic. You're not thinking about anthropological things you can do. And what I mean by anthropological is enacted things, things that you can change about your culture, your lifestyle, your community. And I know there are people that do things like that. And so I'm not indicting everybody who's ever been considered a libertarian or a Libertarian Party member. I'm talking about some of the core attitudinal problems and idea problems behind this ideology and the party. I'm kind of talking about both here. But it's owned by an idolatry of power. Just like it's statist twins, like the Little Caesars. It's fixated on power. It's obsessed with power. You can't rule me. You're not the boss of me. That attitude is a reactive attitude that means you're owned by power rather than mastering and coming out of the matrix of power. So for the person who tries to, someone can be owned by the love of money by being a rich person, spending profligately, spending wildly, crazily, racking up all kinds of bills and spending crazy, just obsessed with money and what it can do. And then you can have the other people who are obsessed with pretending or acting like they are so above it all about money that they wouldn't even put hardly any clothes on. They just walk around in the forest all day and talk about how, they're, so detached and so away from it all. In some sense, they're trying to imitate their money-loving neighbor in a way by just countering and doing the opposite of what they're doing. They're still oriented towards idolizing what their neighbors are doing. So important to remember that. And the same thing again, the worship of the state is idolizing what your neighbor's doing. Oh, if my neighbor could see what I see, oh, I'm so glad that I'm not my neighbor. Fool, right? And that is a position that reacts to what your neighbor's doing rather than creating a positive mimetic role model of something that they can get behind and imitate. And that starts with the heart, starts with the attitude. And ultimately it wants the benefits of a culture of life without the right role model for it, right? You can't just say we can, in a vacuum, create a culture of non-aggression, right? The non-aggression principle, which is a derivative of Christian principle. Christianity goes further than that. Christianity is more radical than that. Jesus is more radical than the non-aggression principle. Jesus is non-aggression and non-vengeance. And more than that, but that you could add something to get a little bit closer to the example of behavior that Christ models for us in history. So you can say that Christ is the founder of the liberty movement, if you want to use that word, in the sense of the pursuit of liberty through history has been inspired by Christ's way. That is so true. You know, the best of of libertarian philosophy is derived from imitating ideas passed down by the culture haunted by the cross and Christ's example of personhood and nonviolence and respect for freedom of conscience, as God is that way. God respects the freedom of the conscience. God respects the freedom of autonomy, the freedom of being able to make the decisions that you want to make, even if it means allowing you to make choices that will harm you. And that is a very beautiful idea that libertarianism tries to express politically, and we don't want to attack that. But it has to be understood properly within a cultural framework that is anchored in the imitation of Jesus Christ as a historical person and all of the cultural inheritance that comes along with that the church has preserved, even in the errors that have also been picked up along the way that humans have made. There is a fount of culture that needs to be honestly dealt with if one is to, bring forth a culture that is life affirming, that is personhood affirming, which means you have to have a humility about where your desires come from. Worshiping your desire is at the heart of some of the mistakes that libertarianism makes attitudinally, in terms of its attitude, its disposition. It is not a good idea to try to get a society to just abstractly take on some kind of Gnostic Cartesian philosophy that they're supposed to tribalistically hold on to in order to be able to express and live out a life of nonviolence and non-aggression and non-vengeance. There is a place, by the way, in the Christian tradition for self-defense, but there is not a place for, vengeance or a place for initiating violence against people to get your way. God does not initiate physical violence against you to get you to understand the reality of the revelation of his incarnation and history. And so too, you have to extend that same disposition of grace and mercy to your neighbor and how you deal with them as well. Unfortunately, though, we don't get that full picture when we focus on trying to glue an Enlightenment philosophy like libertarianism in addition to our Christianity or without Christianity. It doesn't work. It comes from Christianity itself. And some of the ideas, again, that libertarianism espouses are extremely essential and come from Christianity. I would say more so than these other competing ideologies that are in the mix in the West about, how we should situate ourselves. But it still falls short. And therefore, it needs to be fully reckoned with to understand why it won't work. There is a strain of libertarianism that's often called libertinism, that is mimetically obsessed with the idea of fighting against restraints on its desire, and in fact being obsessed with the law itself. And Paul talks about this, that the law provokes people to sin, but there's this spirit that people have of, don't tell me I can't do this, and that idea of me is not a good disposition to have if you want to create a culture of nonviolence and freedom and liberty and pro-life, and I mean pro-life in terms of what life was intended to be. That kind of a philosophy can't fly when you're obsessed with just resisting a law, right? Do what thou wilt. That is the whole of the law. That is Aleister Crowley's philosophy, right? That has no place with Christianity. But Christianity, and see, the thing is, Satanism and Christianity, there are some things about it that on the surface, do what thou wilt. That is the whole of the law. And then you look at Jesus. Jesus says, God desires mercy, not sacrifice. Do not resist evil with violence. And in some surface level, you can see overlap in where these things get confused in people. But the difference is that the Christian says, what am I allowed to do in relationship to my neighbor if I'm imitating the example that Jesus gave me in the way he treated his neighbors? Right? Versus me, right? So it's the difference, again, a cartoonish depiction of the libertarian disposition is, it is my sovereign right to take an AK-47 and shoot bullets in the air right on the edge of my property line, so long as the bullets don't go onto your property line while being high on a drug in front of, the neighborhood. As long as they're not in, on my property and I'm not on theirs, I can walk around, on some drug, shooting an AK-47 in the air, blasting music loud. This kind of obnoxious obsession with the human, with the individual, with the me, is an orientation that makes it dead in the water in terms of relating to human personhood in actual real life community. Right? And I think it's an example of why libertarianism as a political philosophy creates constant schisms and power feuds. See, that's the problem. The deceit of the libertarian philosophy is that if I have this non-aggression principle perfectly mapped out in some kind of platonic plane of my mind, that's the secret to overcoming the state, when it has nothing to do with that. It's your actions, it's your life, it's the way you treat people that overcomes tyranny and changes the world, as Christ exemplified. But look at how obsessed libertarians can get over who is the local treasurer of a county party with $50 in the bank account. They'll fight like tooth and nail over who gets to be the treasurer of a party with $50. The last expenditure was 3 hot dog packs and some mustard. That's not, if you're going to fight to the death over that, then what does that say about your disposition to power and control? Even though you can say, like a Pharisee, well, it's not technically state power. Oh, that means it's okay. No, but your attitude shows everything. And the Christian humility understands something that I want to address here, which is that the Christian understands that one can have strategic empathy for those who are despots and tyrants and thugs that do horrible things to us and to people all over the world. Because one understands that if given the opportunity themselves, they may be seduced and tempted to do similar horrible, unethical, or immoral things like wars or, making calculations that may not be morally pure, right? Because the whole system is rotten. The whole system is a vestige of religion that kills God, that tries to kill Christ at its heart. And God steps into that sacrificial machine through history and reveals the truth to us so that we can mimetically create society in order through his example in a way that is nonviolent and beautiful and life-affirming and family-affirming. So you have to have a telos that actually is real, and Christ and Christianity provides that telos, and it is the fount by which libertarian philosophy has derivatively come out of, but it needs to be basically, libertarianism needs to die, and they get reabsorbed its best elements back into Christianity and properly affirm a Christian worldview, not through the state, okay, we're not doing that, through culture, because that's the problem a lot of folks on the statist side make, is they say, well, to make a public proclamation of something must necessitate control of the state in a top-down imposition. That is incorrect, okay? One can make public goods and public affirmations and civic social norms without the use of state imposition. That is certainly true. But I want to emphasize again that if you're a Christian approaching the problem of tyranny, you understand that as wicked and evil as Hillary Clinton may be, if you had her life story and you had her situation and, walked in her shoes, you may be tempted to succumb to the evil just as easily, if not worse than she did. That is the humble and truly, in my opinion, anti-state position to have, to understand the seduction of power, to understand how it works, and not to kind of sit in some kind of moral, righteous, detachment to say, I would never have done anything like it. And yet they're fighting like tooth and, fighting like cats and dogs over the position of a treasury with $50 on their account. That's your local Libertarian Party. Come on. The fruit shows the truth. You can judge something by the fruit that it bears. And all I see is purity spirals in a lot of what I see around libertarianism as a collective political movement. I'm not indicting individuals different. There's all kinds of wonderful individuals. Many of them probably listen to this program, even though all through my life, I've never said that I was a libertarian, never was a part of the Libertarian Party, and never have subscribed to that philosophy, but I have always seen so much common ideas in terms of affirming peace and prosperity and proper respect for differentiation and boundaries in the property sense of the concept, and non-aggression. Those things are all derivatives, and they're right in so much as, and they're beautiful in so much as they, the best aspects of it are derived from Christianity and the beauty of the kingdom of heaven. But again, it has to have an attitudinal change. It has to have a whole disposition that is not going to be deifying oneself to the point where one says, well, I am truly uniquely individual. All of my desires are my own, and you don't tell me what to do. Change the attitude to, I have no right to harm my neighbor. That is a good attitude. I have no right to use violence against my neighbor. That's a good deconstructive attitude to have. And I think people who mock libertarianism are when they mock that way of thinking about it, are doing something that is, again, against the spirit of imitating Jesus. Jesus said, he who's without sin cast the first stone, when in reference to a mob that wanted to eliminate the life of a woman accused of adultery. And I have said this many times. I think adultery running rampant in a society has probably done more to destroy and create degeneracy and destruction in a community, in a neighborhood, and property destruction and wealth depressions than any drug has ever done. And yet Jesus did not use violence to deal with it, even though he did say, go and sin no more, which is an affront to the libertine type of libertarian who says, don't tell me what's right or wrong. No, I think that's the problem. We can't have a public cultural appetite and foundation to say this is right and this is wrong, and then wisdom to deal with all the complexities of working that out. That does not require a state to do that. That's the mistake that statists and libertarians sometimes make, because again, they're both obsessed with fighting over the same object, which is state power. One wants to wield it and one wants to eliminate it completely, but they're both fighting over the same object, which means they end up becoming obsessed with beating the other rival rather than actually doing something positive that actually is going to achieve the results they say they're animated for. So that's why, some of the issues I have with libertarianism and the party, how can you expect liberty and nonviolence to flourish without acknowledging its source as Jesus, as the example that birthed this concept into your heart in the first place? Because everything you believe in is downstream from, in the West, from the impact of Christianity. And now the world, because of globalism's making so many countries imitate Western ideas that, again, are downstream from Christianity. Even the errors are haunted by the cross. So you need beauty. That's one of the things that when you watch libertarianism and some of its political party functions, you don't see a lot of, and I'm not saying the Republicans and Democrats do this either, but they're certainly lacking. But there's a particular kind of left brain orientation that kind of denies the beauty and the aesthetic part of life. And to the extent that you get people demonstrating music and art, it's often awful, where it's, again, left brain, ham-fisted approaches at trying to shove ideology in some kind of propaganda way through music. And I understand there's a charm to some of that, I guess, for some people, but, singing about the Patriot Act is coming to destroy you. I mean, good Lord have mercy. This is not art, okay? This is just hell, right? We don't want that. This is they fail for the same reason that conservative Christians sometimes fail when they try to make a movie or something, and it's so beneath the beauty of life as it actually is, because it's an affront to our sensibility of the truth. And so, people don't want to sing. It just doesn't create resonance and beauty. It doesn't create wonder in your heart when you're singing about, the merchants of death all the time. I mean, there's a place, obviously, for, a protest type song, no doubt, but that's about the most you ever get. And it's usually not very well designed when you hang around Libertarian Party stuff. So they need beauty. You need beautiful movies. Make a movie like a David Lynch film. Make a movie like a Werner Herzog documentary. Make a great piece of art, right? Make a great opera, and don't put political ideas in the opera explicitly. If there's something you want to say, it'll come out naturally through the experience of, the art of the storytelling that's being done. Storytelling is essential. And it's such a gimmick line, I know, but everybody says they're doing storytelling and they're doing propaganda most of the time. but it shouldn't feel ugly and vulgar. It should feel beautiful and should create mystery and thought, make you think and not tell you what to think. And of course, it should focus, if it wants to be free from the tyranny of what we see all around us, from developing the truth of science. We need folks to be more like Ray Peat when it comes to thinking outside the box and connecting ideas about the way the world is, and Broda Barnes talking about the effects of thyroid in creating dysfunctions in relationships, to the point of many divorces being caused by mismatched thyroid. Someone's got a low thyroid and a high thyroid, and they're having conflict. High stress environment caused by garbage, toxic food people are eating, or toxic exposure to plastics and radiations and Wi-Fi and cell phone right by their thyroid, which even the National Institute for Health shows that it affects your thyroid level, which is going to affect your environment and your attitude in your environment and the way people feel around you. All of those things need to be brought into, and I know that there's people who do like the new age stuff in some libertarian circles, but again, that's not true. It's not good. It's just kind of hammy, cheesy stuff that's not actually getting at the truth of things at the deepest level in a way that actually changes the world. So we need science and technology. And again, when I say technology, I know there are conspiracy people in the libertarian community. They're always talking about secret technologies to create anti-gravity, but it's always like some secret, like fifth dimensional thing. It's all, kind of ridiculous, right? That's why you have to have discernment. It's not just enough to be reacting in anger at the lies and trickery and fraud stuff produced by government and its corporate oligarchs in media and society. It's also important to have discernment and being able to chew the fish and spit out the bones in the world outside of the establishment, where there's a lot of nonsense. And again, people coming up with BS and gobbledygook because they're actually worshiping power and their relationship to their antagonism with the state, rather than actually affirming life and affirming something beautiful, which is a self-giving disposition as Christ models for us. But again, you cannot, that's why it's the dangerous thing to try to take political ideas and situate them in some kind of secular neutral space and then derive economics and, political thought in some kind of isolated sense. That's a left brain hemisphere way of doing things that doesn't produce truth in the real sense of the word. And that's why their presentation doesn't appeal to people. It doesn't move people as it could, because they have some of the best ideas, but again, situating it with ugly propaganda and a disposition of me is just discordant with reality. We need to develop science and technology. If you want to deal with eliminating the state's power, create energy too cheap to meter that everybody can afford, that doesn't require, a huge cost to do and have in your house to power your homes. Beyond solar power, beyond wind farm, low temperature nuclear reaction devices, LENR, or used to be called cold fusion. There's something there. It needs to be further developed. 24/7 energy panels using infrared light, so you're not dependent on intermittent sun and clouds and all that comes along with that. You can have sun powering you can have energy from the environment powering the house in addition to perhaps solar panels. Those are just a couple ideas that I like to think about. I'm sure there's 1,000 more that I've never considered, but that's what a culture that really wants to get rid of tyranny should be focused on. Again, thinking of science in new ways, not relying on, I get so irritated by people who say they're free thinkers, oh, I'm libertarian, I'm a free thinker. And yet they buy into textbook dogmatic physics, as the textbook says, oh, no, this has been determined. This is all factual. I can't think of anything else. And of course, you have the mirror opposites, right, that are always off into wild, crazy land with ideas that don't actually make sense in reality. And the discernment has to navigate away from both of those in this false dialectic. But that's something that, folks need to be mindful of, is if you're truly a truth-free thinker, that means you're not going to be mimetically disposed to you're not going to be mimetically obsessed with kind of affirming the establishment line on a whole host of things. So don't be tribalistic and don't be blind to the way in which tribalism and affirmation of beliefs that are actually not backed by substantial evidence, but rather are backed up by other people telling you that those experts are the true experts, and therefore you need to basically submit your thinking to their paradigm and turn it all off and resist any ideas that go contrary to it. That ideology is pervasive in so many different things of our lives, whether it's diet, biology, physics. I tackle those things a lot on this show, but a whole host of other things. This kind of groupthink mindset that needs to be challenged with vigor and beauty and joy, more than just, trying to attack. Well, I don't like what this politician did today. I'm going to react to that with anger, and I'll get enough people to join me, and we'll just reactively, angrily, like, not do anything to actually deal with the power problem, right? Change the relationship between the human person and these oligarchs, right? The oligarchs have their power based on, false ideas about food, false ideas about nutrition, false ideas about healthcare, false ideas about medicine, false ideas about, physics and what's possible, false ideas about scarcity issues, false ideas about money. So make the things that make their things and their falsehoods and their myths irrelevant and wither away naturally. That's the best place for change against tyranny. And ultimately, this leads to kind of my final thought, which is that political atheism is a superior position to both libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism or other varieties of anarchism, as well as statism. Political atheism is what Jesus Christ exemplified, right? Which is, yes, this is a bad system. We should not participate in it. We should not be deluded in using it to wield violence against our neighbor. But neither should we be owned by its evil too, to the point where we're just reacting in anger, doing nothing to actually do something about it. And also in the same way with the law. Yes, the law can provoke sin, but you shouldn't be obsessed and owned by that provocation, right? And yes, using the law to stamp out every kind of vice is going to create lots of violence and lots of chaos and destruction. But again, just saying that this is a problem does not make it go away. You have to change the environment through art, through science, through technology, and through your personal transformation as a person as well that people want to emulate, which means taking care of your health, taking care of your metabolism, taking care of your relationships, your joy, your thought life. All of those things come into real, true focus when we look at this the right way. Political atheism is the reality that we have to reject all the gods of the state and oligarchs. We have to reject all of it, including these ideologies we create that are in reaction to them, right? Because ultimately they're still mimetically fixated on one-upping their neighbor who is a statist rather than actually dealing with the problems that are actually occurring in real life. So this position that many libertarian ideologues have boils down to something that Jesus encountered in his time when he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets." And so ultimately, one of the issues that the libertarian philosophy as a whole tends to have is this kind of attitude that, well, if we were given this power, we wouldn't have done things the way Trump or Bush or McCain or Romney did. Or if we, were elected, we would be able to fearlessly slash all these budgets, even if our children are threatened and our lives are threatened, our finances are threatened, and we're accused of all kinds of false crimes and every other thing that they can do to get people to comply. Oh, we would have enough temerity and power to just bully through it all, and enough intellect and enough showmanship or charisma or whatever, to just through our sheer force of will, we can just overcome all these things. That critiques the Little Caesar's idea too. They're dreaming of a little Caesar coming through like a little Napoleon, little 4-foot Napoleon running on the hills to save them, right, from all the woke insanity. But that's a delusion that's similar to the libertarian delusion that was often there. That, well, if we were if we were given a shot at power, we would just boldly go against it all. And I thought that when I saw Trump's speech and I saw them kind of booing him and stuff. And I look, I'm not on the Trump MAGA, ideology hive mind either. But I thought, it's kind of interesting. They're all hissing and booing at him and saying he was a tyrant. And I thought, if from his perspective, I wonder if he said, have you guys actually ever fought the deep state? Have you actually contended with it in any way? I mean, you could say I got mowed over, but you're just reading a book about it and then going to a conference and being angry. Trump actually got in there and, you can say again that he's failed to accomplish what he said he was going to do on a lot of things. But he also, did do some things that no other president has had and has become, the target of indictments and things to a degree nobody else has. And I think you've got to be insane to think, well, he's totally just completely an actor and in on it when he's got all these indictments and things. That's not the way you would want to spend your retirement years. If you could have your choice, okay, I'm in on this, Clinton, Hillary. So we're all together. We're all buddies and I'm going to play the villain and you're going to indict me with 91 indictments and all these lawsuits and take all my money and time and resources, but it's all okay because I'm going to get a book deal out of it. I mean, what delusional nonsense do some of these conspiracy people have? That don't recognize that there is something a little bit different about Trump's relationship to the status quo and the oligarchy of DC than some of the other uniparty establishment. And even though he doesn't act on fulfilling a lot of the visions that he has said, which have some overlap with libertarian ideas, again, you have to have a level of strategic empathy that requires a little bit of humility and wisdom to be able to say, well, what would you have done if given the same position? And Jesus makes it clear that those who say, I was in that situation, I wouldn't have killed the prophets. He says you testify against yourself because your own arrogance, assuming that you would be morally impervious to any kind of temptation or mistake or deception or blackmail or any of the things that people go through, that you would just be above all, shows how ignorant you may be at being suckered into the tricks and the deceit of power. So that's it for this episode of A Neighbor's Choice. I hope you enjoyed it. You can follow me at David Gornoski on X, or you can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. Godspeed.